Our story. This is our story, they tell me. Long ago, we lived in another place, a place of peace and beauty. But then the fires came and the floods, and we had to leave that place. We traveled for 100 days and 100 nights across the water. And then for another 100 days and another 100 nights, we walked across the land we had found, until we reached the hillside with the snake and the tree. We knew then that we were home, because the gods had foretold this place. They had come to us in visions. They had guarded us on our journey to our new home. They gave us the tree to build our temple on the hill, so that we might worship them for all our days. We sit now in that very temple, and we give our thanks for the home the gods provided. Are there no other stories? I ask. No, none. This is the only story. Our story. But after I leave them, after I walk away from the whitewashed halls of the building that sits atop the hillside, I wander down to the river. There, I find the old crone who fishes every day, her hands and toes webbed to better catch her prey. She has no name, none that she shares, but we spend hours together in the summer sun, side by side, fishing, me with my pole and line, her with her clever hands. I tell her our story. I tell her this is the only one. She laughs. Yours is not the only story. Long ago, my people lived in another place too, deep under the water, where it was salty and dark. But over time, there were those born who needed the light and the air, who needed the water to run fresh and clear and free of the tang of salt. Those children of the light moved away from their home in the deep water, and they found the land. They found the streams and the lakes. They traveled along those streams until they found a place with a tree on top of a hill, a tree that gave shelter and food, a friend. They knew then this was their new home, and they settled here in the shade of the tree, fishing and hunting, one with the land. Until the day the others arrived, and they too saw the tree. But rather than shelter in the shade of the tree, they cut the tree down and built their temple where it had stood. In honor of their gods, they drove away those who had come before. I leave her and go back to the temple. I tell them of her story, but they shake their heads. No, that is not our story. That is another story, a story of the other. We have told you our story of might and destiny. There is no other story. Once more, I leave the temple, but this time my feet take me to the market, loud and wild, with all the voices and all the animals and goods for sale. I find my favorite stall, the one that belongs to the woman who wears layer after layer of cloth wound around and flowing from her body. The woman who paints the lids of her eyes and her lips in colors I've never seen before. I sit with her as she chats and barters and weaves rugs of such beautiful colors, it makes my eyes hurt. I tell her our story. I tell her it is the only story. She laughs, and her laugh is like the wind chimes that hang outside my room, clear and pure. That may be your story, she says, but it is not my story. My people lived in a land of plenty for thousands upon thousands of years. We learned and we studied and we acquired all of the knowledge of the world until the day the raiders came and they burned it all to the ground. And we fled. For many years we traveled here, there, stopping for a year or 2 or 10. But always we pushed onward to somewhere new, somewhere different. We split apart and lost one another along the way until the whole world was ours, and yet nowhere was ours. Until I alone traveled to this city with its temple upon a hill. And I found a place amongst those in the market, a place where I could weave my rugs and listen to the silly tales of foolish children who think their story is the only one. She smiles to take away the sting of her words, but I leave anyway, driven back to the temple. I tell them her story, but they laugh at me. We are not wanderers. We are a people with a direction, driven by the gods. We were never lost. We just weren't home yet. We have told you our story. There is no other story. I leave the temple once more, and I walk to the edge of town where there are taverns and inns. I sit on a stool in the back of the bar where my uncle works, and I tell him our story. But a man at the bar tells me I'm wrong as he drinks his ale. That may be your story, little one, but it is not mine. Mine is a tale of adventure. I don't know who birthed me. I don't know who raised me. I was on my own from as long as I could remember. I had friends, but they came and went. I somehow found food and shelter and grew until I was a young man, old enough to be hired to work as a caravan guard. I have traveled ever since, from town to town, country to country. I have heard many stories told, in many different voices and tongues. Your story may be yours, but it is not mine, and it is not hers, or his, or theirs. Your story is just one of the drops in the ocean, one of the stars in the sky. Your story is a story, but it is not the story. Late that night, I finally return home. My mother's mother sits by the fire, her hands wrapped in cloths like they've always been, her eyes rheumy with age. I tell her about the story I learned at temple, and I tell her about the others I spoke to that day, each with their own story. I ask her what my story is. Is it the story they tell at the temple? Or do I have a different story? She pulls me onto her lap, and I cuddle against her side as she starts to speak. They will tell you there is only one story. They will tell you there is only one truth. But they are wrong. She unwinds the cloth from around her hands, and I see the faintest hint of a web between each finger as she speaks. My father's people traveled for 100 days and 100 nights, and then 100 more to reach this place. My mother's people came from the water, back when salt tasted sweet. My mother's father found his way here from a place far, far away, where all the knowledge of the world once lived, before it was burned to nothing by ignorant fools who didn't know what it was they destroyed. And my father's mother never knew her people. She was taken in by a kind couple who found her alone in the night, babbling in a tongue none had ever heard. They are all a part of our story. They are all a part of you. But your story, my child, is your own. Your story is the one you choose to tell. It's the threads in the tapestry that you choose to see, whether that be a single strand or many. As I fall asleep that night, I think about what my grandmother said, about how all of the stories are mine, about how I can choose whichever one I want. And I smile, because they are all my story, and yet none of them are my story. My story is yet to be written.